and the sun, Jerusalem.
We are so delighted that we have once again lecturing in our congregation Professor Michael Sharnoff, and Michael is now the Associate Professor at the National Defense University, Near Eastern South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Before joining NESA, he served as Associate Professor of Middle East Studies and Director of Regional Studies at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security. While at DMGS, Dr. Sharnoff taught graduate courses on Arab-Israeli conflict, the history and politics of the modern Middle East, and the radical Islamist movements. He holds a PhD in Middle East Studies from King's College in London. His research focuses on Egypt under the Nasser period and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the modern history and politics of Syria and Jordan. Before joining DMGS, he worked as a policy center in Washington, and he lectured for the Defense Institute Security Assistance Management. We have been very blessed to have Michael participate in many lectures at Washington Hebrew. And what I find fascinating is that Michael is a natural born pedagogue. He is a clear and concise and great teacher. And I don't think there's anybody else who could give us the opportunity tonight, which is so incredibly pertinent. He's teaching us tonight Israel, the Palestinian, and the Arab states. I've asked Michael to give us the context and background, and I will turn it over to him. But again, I want to thank you with all that you're doing, that you take the time and devote yourself to Washington Hebrew. We're incredibly indebted, and we're very jealous of your abilities, and we're very proud of your abilities. So I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Lustig, for that kind introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can hear me clearly. Okay, great. Thank you, Rabbi, and everyone at Washington Hebrew Congregation for inviting me. And I want to thank everyone for taking time out to join me, especially under these difficult circumstances. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Today, for my talk on Israel and the West Bank, I wanted to try and put it in a historical context to provide some perspective about, looking at how the actors on the ground have perceived the West Bank, how the West Bank has changed under different administrations throughout history. And then I would like to conclude with how have we gotten to the stage where we're at today, where now there is open conversation in Israel about annexing and applying sovereignty to parts of territory in the West Bank that it has effectively controlled for 53 years now. So that's where I'd like to conclude. But to begin, I want to provide some of the background in history. So first of all, when we talk about the West Bank, this is a significant piece of territory. It is home to about 2.9 or 3 million Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians. There's also about 450,000 Israeli Jews living in the West Bank. And the territory is bordered to Jordan in the east and Israel to the west. And the part that we are hearing about in the news about potential annexation or applying sovereignty is also part of the West Bank. This is known as the Jordan Valley, which is a strategic territory that stretches along the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. And when we talk about the West Bank, even the name itself sort of obscures part of the longstanding Jewish connection to the territory. There is, after all, an unbroken 3,200-year Jewish presence in the West Bank, which until recently, really until 1950, the land or the territory had historically been referred to as Judea and Samaria. And it is home to the second holiest site in Judaism, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, which is located in Hebron. And it is also home to Joseph's tomb in Nablus. Now, having said that, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is also and has been home to Arabic-speaking Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, and Christians for centuries. So, you know, the territory had never been a distinct independent entity. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, the West Bank was part of the British Mandate for Palestine. And when that was handed over in 1947 to the United Nations to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, the territory that we now know as the West Bank was actually allotted to a future Arab state. But of course, as we know from history, what happened in 1948, May 14th, 1948, the Jews of Palestine declared their independence. And the next day, the neighboring Arab countries invaded the new Jewish state, and war broke out. And after the war, after the 1948 First Arab-Israeli War, you know, you had about 6,000 Israeli Jews who'd perished, or 1% of the population, and you had about 700 to 750,000 of those Arabs of Palestine, the Muslims and Christian inhabitants of Palestine, they fled. Under a combination of duress or expulsion, there was a refugee population transfer. They fled Palestine. Most of them entered Transjordan, which is now known as Jordan. And after the war, Transjordan, which is Jordan, had occupied Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and the old city of Jerusalem. And this is significant because when Jordan occupied these territories, it absorbed about 450,000 Palestinian Arabs into its kingdom, into its Hashemite kingdom. It doubled its population, it doubled its size through the control now of the West Bank, and it formally annexed the West Bank in 1950. So this whole discussion that we have today about annexation is not actually unique or novel in history. The West Bank has been annexed previously, and it was done so by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1950. And in doing so, Jordan was the only Arab country, to its credit, to grant the Palestinians, when they fled after the war, citizenship. All the other Arab countries kept the Palestinians wherever they fled to, whether it was Lebanon or Syria or Egypt or the Gulf, they kept them stateless as refugees. Jordan absorbed them, annexed the territory to the kingdom, and provided citizenship and passports, Jordanian passports, to these Palestinian Arabs. And that situation, which was known in 1950 as the unification of Jordan and Arab Palestine, or the unification of Jordan and the West Bank, that situation of unity, where the West Bank was a part of Jordan, lasted from 1950 until 1967. But during this time, the Arabs of Palestine that were part of Jordan, there really was not any significant movement or momentum to establish an independent Palestinian state. These Palestinian Arabs were part of Jordan. Egypt, after 1948, had occupied the Gaza Strip. And unlike Jordan, Egypt did not offer the Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip Egyptian citizenship, nor did Egypt put them on any path toward autonomy, let alone statehood. But the Egyptians ruled the territory with an iron fist under a military government, and there were curfews and strict measures in place. But the general idea was, at that time, from 1949 to 1967, that the notion of Palestine, or the potential for there to be a Palestinian homeland, excluded the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, because those territories were under Arab rule. They were under Jordanian rule with the West Bank, and the Gaza was under Egyptian rule. And the real, the testament to that, or the evidence, is when you look at the original PLO charter, the Palestine Liberation Organization, it was established in 1964, 3 years before Israel conquered the West Bank and became in possession of it, as it has been since. But during that time, the West Bank was part of Jordan and Gaza was part of Egypt. The PLO And the Palestinians, in their public declarations and threats to fight against Israel, they specifically omitted any reference to claiming sovereignty over the West Bank or Gaza because they were in Arab hands. That's why you didn't see really any direct military attacks or operations by Palestinians against Egypt or Jordan during that time. It was excluded. While it was part of the historic British Mandate of Palestine, this was not something at the time that the Palestinians themselves were talking about, declaring an independent Palestinian state. Now, this, of course, changes, gradually, but it does change after the 1967 war, where in just 6 days, Israel triples its territory. It conquers the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem from Jordan. It conquers the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and it conquers the Golan Heights from Syria. And so basically overnight after 1967, you have this new scenario where all of these Palestinians that were living in the West Bank and they were part of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, they are now under Israeli control. But just because Jordan lost the war and they lost their territory, what's very interesting is after 1967, it did not stop the Jordanians from trying to reclaim the West Bank, not to have it as some kind of independent Palestinian state, but to reclaim it back and restore it back under the Hashemite monarchy. So after the war, Jordan continued to finance Palestinians on the West Bank and compete with Yasser Arafat and the PLO in the hopes that Palestinians on the West Bank would look to King Hussein for inspiration and look to him as their spokesperson to restore the West Bank. He floated different proposals. There was one famous proposal King Hussein put forward in 1972, in which he, in a speech, said that he was willing to restructure the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan into a united Arab kingdom that would be a federated model. It was a federal plan or a federation of two halves, the East Bank, which would be Jordan, and the West Bank, which would be this autonomous Palestinian entity, but all of the power would still hold true with the central government in Amman, the capital of Jordan, and King Hussein would really hold ultimate control. But that was a proposal that he put forward in the hopes of trying to regain the territory. The Palestinians rejected it. The Israelis rejected it. Most of the Arab countries rejected it. The Palestinians viewed it as a plot or a scheme to liquidate their movement by, once again having the West Bank go under a different government's control, in this case Jordan. And the Israelis rejected it because it wasn't absolutely clear that in exchange for this type of federal solution, that if Israel then withdrew from the West Bank and gave it back to Jordan, would Jordan unequivocally terminate its belligerency and sign a peace treaty with Israel? Another red line for most Israelis was part of this federal program required that Israel relinquish the old city of Jerusalem, Eastern Jerusalem, back into Jordanian hands. And, Israelis, generally speaking, at that time, and still to some extent this holds true today, Jerusalem is a very sensitive, almost a red line issue, whether you are, left wing or right wing or religious or conservative. It is such a emotionally charged and spiritual issue. Most Israelis view the 1967 war, they look at it as the reunification of Jerusalem, making Jerusalem united under total Israeli sovereignty. And there's been really little flexibility when it comes to Jerusalem. West Bank is a different story. But nonetheless, in the 1970s and even in the 1980s, the Jordanians under King Hussein still sought to represent the Palestinians and to find some type of arrangement, either through a federation with the Palestinians in the West Bank or perhaps some type of, confederation solution. There was hope that somehow that this territory could be ceded back to Jordan to fulfill some kind of political solution or perhaps a peace treaty. But this did not happen, as we know in history. And what's really interesting is what we see is as time passed on throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the Jordanian influence, as time elapsed, people stopped and they started to forget more and more what it was once like under Jordanian rule. And with the rise and influence of Yasser Arafat and the PLO really became the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And they figured this was their responsibility to confront Israel, to challenge Israel, to establish their own homeland. And they wanted to do it really without Jordan's help. And when the first Palestinian intifada or uprising against Israel happened in 1988, in July 1988, King Hussein, in a speech, formally renounced all administrative and legal ties to the West Bank. This was very significant because, the immediate reaction and the message that the king tried to send was when he saw the uprising with Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza protesting against Israeli rule, the king of Jordan feared that kind of instability could spill over from the West Bank into the East Bank and destabilize his kingdom or challenge his rule at the very least. So, by doing that, that's one sort of precautionary message he tried to adopt to help put Jordan first and to sever ties and to emphasize the notion that Jordan is Jordan, meaning Jordan consists of territory east of the Jordan River, and Palestine is the territory west of the Jordan River. Because prior to that time, there had always been this ambiguity that maybe Jordan is Palestine, or maybe Jordan could be a Palestinian state. You hear sometimes Israelis, even this is a minority opinion in Israel, it's not the majority and it's certainly not official policy, but every now and then you hear some Israelis say, well, Jordan is Palestine, therefore there's no need to create a additional Palestinian state. That rhetoric and that ideology does not really come out of a vacuum. There is precedent for that because during that entire period, as I mentioned, during Jordanian control of the West Bank, King Hussein, his brother, Prince Hassan ibn Talal, other Jordanian officials would frequently make claims in speeches, interviews, saying things that Jordanians and Palestinians are one people, Jordan is Palestine, and Palestine is Jordan. And that sort of added to the ambiguity and confusion over where Jordan's borders begin and where Palestine's ended. But with King Hussein's disengagement plan in 1988, where he effectively, renounced claims or ties to the West Bank, that sought to send a message to the Israelis that, hey, look, if you thought for all this time that you can try to transform Jordan into an alternative Palestinian homeland, that's not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen. Jordan is Jordan. It's a sovereign country. We are no longer going to try and represent the Palestinians in diplomatic forums at the United Nations and other venues. This was also a very stern message and warning to Yasser Arafat. There's almost a sense of frustration with King Hussein. And by renouncing ties, which, by the way, this was not coordinated with the Palestinians. It caught Arafat and his friends by surprise. By doing this, the king basically said, look to the Palestinians, you are now responsible for your own destiny. Do not come to us looking for help. We do not want to represent you. We tried doing that for 2 decades, and we're tired of doing it. And this is now, you say that you're the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This is now your responsibility. Shoulder the burden and negotiate or find a way to determine your own fate without us. Having said that, just because King Hussein disengaged from the West Bank, it did not mean, and it still does not mean, that the Jordanians do not have a stake or an interest in a political solution across the River Jordan. They are still very keenly aware, interested, and want to be a part of whatever happens in any final status arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians. Because for the Jordanians, you know, this issue of the West Bank is incredibly sensitive. And for them, it's not actually a domestic issue. This is really, it's not a foreign policy issue. This is actually a domestic issue because the majority population of Jordan is ethnically Palestinian. There's that history of the Hashemites ruling over the land. And so, you know, they look at this as very critical to their own national security and sovereignty. And more importantly, you know, when we look at what's happening today, most recently with the Trump Peace to Prosperity initiative and these kind of talks that we're seeing about possible Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank, the Jordanians, apart from the immediate players on the ground, which are the Israelis and the Palestinians, they are the most actively engaged and affected by any outcome. There is a perennial fear inside the Kingdom of Jordan that, you know, in the absence of some type of diplomatic solution with the Palestinians, that Israel or the United States or both will somehow seek to solve the Palestinian problem at Jordan's expense and just dump the problem at their lap and have them try and manage it. At the same time, there's another concern in Jordan that if Israel goes ahead with some type of annexation in the West Bank, that could then create another exodus of Palestinians fleeing the West Bank into the East Bank. And what's really fascinating is, although there has been that renunciation of claims to the West Bank in 1988, and there have also been Israeli-Jordanian peace. Jordan was the second Arab country after Egypt. Egypt was 1978, 1979. Jordan signed peace with Israel in 1994. That terminated the two states' belligerency against one another, and it finally demarcated the borders and boundaries between both countries, which consequently tried to put to rest that notion that Jordan is Palestine, or Jordan could be an alternative homeland or play some type of role as it did pre-1967 or even pre-1988, where it still sought to regain the West Bank. So that's why the Jordanians are probably the most vocal in the statements that are coming out in the Middle East. You know, once again, apart from the Palestinians, the Jordanians fear that they have the most to lose from potential annexation or sovereignty application in the West Bank. If we look at some of the other countries in the Middle East, you know, there's the Gulf Arab countries, which I'm sure some of you know, have recently quietly, but not so quietly anymore. It used to be more private or taboo, but very recently, Israel and some of the Gulf Arab countries, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they have engaged in various levels of security cooperation. You know, this is a very changing Middle East. It's a very different and dynamic Middle East. This is not the Middle East of the Cold War, when Gamal Abdel Nasser was the champion of the Arab world, and it was, you know, the strong Arab countries like Egypt under Nasser, Saddam under Iraq, and Hafez al-Assad under Syria, where the objective was fighting and destroying Israel. We've moved past that from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's really no longer the generic, broad Arab-Israeli conflict. It's really shrunken more to a Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So much so, it was probably even unthinkable just a couple of years ago. You may have seen this in the news, but the other week, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates ambassador to the United States, published an op-ed in an Israeli newspaper appealing to the Israeli public. I think this was the first time in history that an Arab leader reached out in Hebrew to the Israeli people, appealing to them, not to unilaterally annex territory in the West Bank. He was not threatening to declare war against Israel. He was not vowing to sanction or boycott Israel. It was really coming from a position where he was saying, hey, look, we have worked together quietly over these years, and we want to accept you as a normal country in the Middle East. We want to work with you. We want to welcome you. But if you do this, it's going to become increasingly difficult to normalize relations with you. And that sentiment, I think, is shared with other Gulf countries, because while we have seen some very interesting public overtures by Gulf Arab leaders toward Israel, they are still going to be cautious, these leaders, and there's a certain degree of restraint where they're going to feel a little reticent or skeptical to move too fast, too forward ahead of the general Arab public opinion, which is still somewhat skeptical, negative, or even hostile toward Israel. But the Arab leaders seem to be moving a little bit ahead of their people because they see that the Middle East is changing and the threats and the priorities are changing. And for many Middle Eastern countries, the big priority is not about fighting or destroying Israel or even establishing a Palestinian state. It's about curbing Iranian influence. It's about fighting radicalism, extremism, and terrorism. It's about trying to sustain their populations economically, politically, socially, providing security and health expertise during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, there's a whole list of challenges, new challenges, where, for Israel, according to these countries in the Arab Middle East, Israel might no longer be that kind of priority or threat like it had been 40, 50, 60 years ago. So it's definitely a new Middle East, and it would be unfortunate as Israel has cultivated ties, not just with Egypt and Jordan, formally with peace treaties, but as it's also branched out and made inroads into other countries like Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. It would be unfortunate if by conducting some type of unilateral measures in the West Bank, if that would then undermine, challenge, or complicate or hinder these possibilities. Now, having said that, I also want to put a different angle about the context of what we're looking at with the risks and challenges with Israel right now in the year 2020, applying sovereignty in the West Bank. Some analysts might argue that if we look at recent historical precedents, when some analysts might have thought that there would be mass violence and unrest and instability after the United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, when the United States formally recognized the Golan Heights, a disputed territory between Israel and Syria, as a legitimate part of Israel, when the United States expelled the PLO from its mission from Washington, D.C., there was all this speculation that, if these actions take place, it could ignite perhaps another intifada or some type of Palestinian reaction. And every time along the way, the reaction was by and large very muted. There were no significant protests. There was no intifada. The Middle East did not unravel. Now, this is not to be confused with, did Palestinians willingly go along with it and accept it or love it? No, they didn't, but it did not elicit that same type of violence that many predicted. And I say that in the context of how some people today might say, well, look, Israel can unilaterally right now do whatever it wants because the Arab world is totally preoccupied with all these other challenges. So therefore, it can do what it wants and no one's going to stop them. And based on those other recent historical precedents, the likelihood for violence to occur by Palestinians is very low, because look what happened after the recognition of Jerusalem and the embassy moving of Jerusalem. And I would agree with that up to a point and to an extent where I think that there is some truth to that. But the only difference that I see about why that this could be different this time around compared to the past couple of years is, when you look at the context of this COVID-19 pandemic. You know, whether you agree that Israel has the right to annex or apply sovereignty in the West Bank, is you know, just try to steer aside for a moment. But if you just look at the climate, the political climate right now, you know, to question the wisdom of doing something like that now during COVID-19, when you have millions of Arabs in the West Bank, in Jordan, in the neighborhood, in Israel, that are unemployed or underemployed. They may be living at home, jobless. They're probably very scared, frustrated, angry, looking to provide food for their families. You know, I don't see a whole lot of good coming out, as the risks might outweigh, you know, the rewards at a time like this. It is different. This is a very different political climate with this pandemic. And I think with having, you know, millions of very frustrated and rightfully so people who are living at home, who are scared, they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they don't have any paycheck at all, it would not take much to probably incentivize them to protest. If they're looking for a reason to protest, if you don't have a whole lot to do and a lot of time on your hands and you're angry, I could see certain leaderships in the West Bank or Gaza to try and channel that rage, not against them, but against Israel. So that's why I would caution that I think we certainly have to be aware and open to this consideration. So the Palestinians are certainly affected by this because this is territory that they claim for their state. And it would certainly undermine, if this happens, prospects for a viable, contiguous, independent Palestinian state in part of the West Bank. But I want to say this also, not only does this affect the Palestinians and the Jordanians, this also will impact, if it goes through, the Israelis. This will prompt a lot of questions for Israelis to ponder about their long-term future as a majority Jewish democratic state. I mean, this also touches and plays into themes about what type of future political government and ideology does the state of Israel want, if it does some type of unilateral action in the West Bank, when it's not entirely clear at this moment, if Israel annexes, what will happen to those thousands of Palestinians that live in the Jordan Valley? Will they be given Israeli citizenship? Will they remain stateless? I don't think they can be given Jordanian citizenship. So while this directly affects the Palestinians, this also poses legitimate long-term questions about Israel's identity, its form of governance, its form of ideology, of what kind of state does it want to be. And so, you know, with that, I want to make sure that there is plenty of time for questions and answers, and I'll stop my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was wonderful. There's a lot of, you covered a tremendous amount of territory in a very short time and in a very efficient and good way. And I think what we're going to try to do is that we have a lot of people on. We have over 99 devices, which is, and most of them have two. So we maybe if you put questions into the chat box, we'll try to do some that way. And if we do some unmuting, we might let some other questions come in a different way. I'm going to start off and just ask you a little bit more, to go into a little bit more depth about what you think the advantages are for this, that are motivating this, because it seems that, I'm quite familiar with some of the leaders, that the tension between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and their common enemy of Iran as well, and the opportunities and the cooperation, both economically and technologically, between Israel and its opportunities, it seems like that it is a very poor thing to alienate at this particular point those moderate countries that have come an awful long way. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi. And in case I forgot to mention in the very beginning, as a faculty member of National Defense University, which is part of the government, I guess it's my duty to remind everyone that these views are mine alone and do not necessarily represent those of the Department of Defense or any federal agency. So just to get that out of the way, you know, I look at this and I see, you know, if the question was, well, how did we arrive at this situation? I think from the Israeli perspective, this is actually a long time in the making, and I think that that when we look at what happened after Camp David II, where there was an attempt under President Clinton with Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, however imperfect it may have been, but there was an attempt to offer the Palestinians sovereignty and statehood. When that collapsed, and not only when it collapsed, but then when we saw that, you know, Arafat incited the second intifada and launched for 5 years, you know, violence against Israel. When you look at that, the messages that were coming out and how Israelis reacted to it. When we look at, and again, this is from the Israeli perspective, I'm just trying to give some context. When we look at in 2005, under Ariel Sharon, who was no dove, his unilateral disengagement of 7,000 Israeli civilians and soldiers in the Gaza Strip, and in exchange, instead of having the Gaza Strip potentially being built up as some kind of model experiment for Palestinian sovereignty, which then could be replicated in parts of the West Bank, you know, the opposite happened. The Israelis got Hamas in 2006 in Palestinian elections, and they got thousands of Qassam rockets and missiles launched at them. And that resulted in 3 mini wars between Israel and Hamas. And what I'm trying to say is I think what happened, something happened in the Israeli political spectrum among leftists, even people maybe in the center of Israeli politics. I think that for a lot of people who might have been on the fence or sympathetic to believing that there could be a two-state solution, or there could be a Palestinian neighbor that wants to coexist peacefully, not in place of, but alongside of Israel, I think something after that second intifada and the Gaza withdrawal with the rise of Hamas and all the rocketry, I think something changed, something snapped. I think we saw really since 2005 the decline of the left wing in Israeli politics, and the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu and the right wing, who's been in power since 2008, 2009. I think, you know, many Israelis became disillusioned after what happened when you try to offer a state as they did in 2000, or when you unilaterally withdraw from territory like they had done so in Gaza in 2005. I think it really did not convince a lot of a plurality of Israelis that the Palestinians want to live next to them. And that's just, once again, that's how I think a lot of Israelis felt, who might have been even in the middle of politics, centrist, moderate. And I think that partially explains why we have seen a steady rise of Netanyahu and the Likud, and his platform. You know, he has made it very clear that there will be no Palestinian state under his watch. He, from his perspective, he sees an ally in the White House who not only may wink at him with regard to unilateral action in the West Bank, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, Secretary of State Pompeo recently said, you know, it's really not for us to say. It's really up for the Israelis to decide what they do. And so that could be construed or interpreted as a green light, as a license for Israel to, after 53 years of controlling the West Bank, to make it official. You know, Israel de facto controls the West Bank. But by this application of sovereignty, what I think the Netanyahu government, I think what their thinking is, what their strategy is they want to make it official. They want to try and erode or bury the possibility of the Palestinians to have a state in all of the West Bank, and this is their efforts in doing so. But the real interesting question, or response rather, will be, just because Netanyahu has talked about this annexation, will he actually do it? Which is a whole nother issue.
I think that that's a great analysis, and I just want to ask you, because historically, I think it's fair to say that the Arab states really don't ultimately care about the consequences of the Palestinians, except for the effect it has on their own populace and ability to rule. Because there's never been anybody that's gone on to really rescue or not. You can elucidate that and tell me whether you think that's accurate or not. But I'm more interested in, if that is perhaps the case, it's going to make the opportunities for Israel that much more hard to swallow, as you mentioned. The UAE, the Saudi Arabia, which both have had gestures out to Israel and have had cooperation with Israel, are now going to have a very difficult time selling that to their populace. And what happens to those relationships if there's a regime change in Iran? How does Iran play in the dynamics of this? And then we're going to go to other people's questions, because there's tons. But thank you, Michael, if you'd respond.
Yeah, certainly. All great questions and points. I think I think we have to separate the attitudes and perceptions of certain Arab leaders versus the Arab public. And I want to emphasize this. Broadly speaking, the Palestinian cause still generates a lot of sympathy among the Arab masses, the people, the Arabic people, the Arab populations. That's true. That's always been the case. And for the most part, that still is the case. It is true that there have been some attitude shifts for a variety of reasons, new priorities, as you mentioned, with Iran. But by and large, make no mistake, it's ironic that the two Arab countries that have formal diplomatic relations with Israel, Egypt and Jordan, their populations hold some of the most anti-Israel views, because they still perceive the Palestinian problem as a historical injustice. But we have seen recently Arab leaders making very unprecedented public gestures and outreach toward Israel. My personal opinion, I think, is that even if annexation moves forward, I don't think that would prevent the type of security cooperation among some of those Gulf Arab countries with Israel, because from their perspective, it's all Iran, Iran, Iran. Iran is the biggest challenge from their perspective. It's the biggest threat. And I don't think that Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE want to jeopardize security cooperation with Israel that's under the radar for the Palestinians. At the same time, if annexation does go forward, you're right, it will be very difficult for those Arab leaders to still put forth those kind of public gestures, because they are receptive to their populations. They can't move that far ahead away from their people. So that will certainly put constraints on their ability to maneuver openly and publicly. But most likely, yes, the security cooperation will persist privately. And with respect to Iran or different regime change in Iran, it's a great question, and it's very difficult to predict. Look, the Iranian leadership, they've been in power since 1979. They are still very, as an autocratic, theocratic dictatorship, they are still very firmly entrenched in the Iranian system with the Revolutionary Guard. They're very efficient, they're very brutal. I don't really see at this stage a whole lot of evidence to suggest that we could see some type of leadership change in Iran in the near future.
So, Michael, there are a number of questions, and I'm going to read some of these. Some of them you've touched on before. Can you comment on Netanyahu's position on annexing the Jordan Valley and the role of Hezbollah. And then a follow-up, why does Israel want to annex the territory, which you've talked a little bit about? Why isn't this Israel's interest to do this? My understanding is that there are only about 5,000 Arabs living in the area that may be annexed. Is that correct? And in the context of annexation, how does Israel maintain the democratic character long term? That we'll stop with those and then we'll go further. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Harvey and Mark. I see both for your questions. I'll start with you, Harvey. You know, I think like I touched on, I think the Netanyahu government, their interest in this annexation, certainly their talk about it, I think just is their way of, after 53 years of the state of Israel controlling this territory de facto, I think they are looking to sort of sanction it, legalize it, make it official de jure, while they think that they have a strong ally in the White House who would not obstruct any unilateral measure. And so by doing so, not only would they have a wink and a nod from their perspective in the United States to do this, but it would also, you know, theoretically, you know, undermine or prevent the possibility for the Palestinians to have their independent state in the West Bank. So that's part of it. I think you said, yeah, there's approximately, it's my understanding, 5,000, it might be it might be a little bit higher, 7,000 or 8,000 Arabs Palestinian Arabs that are in that part of the Jordan Valley that could be annexed. But once again, even under Netanyahu's own administration, the talks about annexation are quite ambiguous. It is not entirely clear to me precisely what would be annexed, who would fall under that, and again, what would be the fate of those people, the non-Jewish Arab inhabitants of the West Bank. Would they be granted Israeli citizenship? Would they be stateless? It is not clear to me. I don't think that has been unequivocally specified, and this is a significant issue because that cuts into the core of Israel's own democracy that many people inside Israel and in the United States and abroad are legitimately concerned about. So that is a real issue. The next question with Mark, I see in the context of annexation, how could Israel maintain its democratic character long term? You know, the prospect of Israel, which I believe has always been Israel's goal from the very beginning, which is why it was created as a state in the first place. Israel was not created as a state to be like any other state. Israel is not like any other state. You know, there's 22 Arab states in the world. There's 53 Muslim majority states in the world. Israel is the only majority Jewish state. And Israel's legitimacy, Israel's international legitimacy, is a result of the partition plan by the United Nations in 1947. Same legitimacy with Jordan, by the way. Israel's existence, like Jordan's, is an outcome of partition. And as soon as the United States and Russia and then other countries began to recognize the nation state of Israel, Israel's legitimacy was established. Israel's legitimacy is established internationally within its pre-1967 borders. No one is saying outside of parts of the Arab world that Israel has to go back to certain parts pre-1967. In other words, Israel has to give away Tel Aviv or Haifa. No one in the West is saying that at an official capacity. Now, where people in the international community and the United Nations resolutions, most recently, by the way, in 2016 with UN Security Council Resolution 2338, which said that the settlement enterprise, the settlement activity in the West Bank is illegal. There's a problem with that territorial acquisition after 1967, but there is not a problem with Israel's legitimacy pre-1967, or Israel proper, as it were. But the issue of the West Bank, and if Israel starts to unilaterally annex, that then will create a problem cutting into the core of Israel's very legitimacy. So I hope that answers that.
Michael, could you just comment, because you talk about the democracy and the issues of democracy, and there was Dr. Gavisar and others were commissioned to do a whole study on the democracy. How has the basic law impacted in terms, and was it used as an internal movement towards this legitimacy or part of the building of the Netanyahu regime to actually, if you will, dismantle the left and create a platform by which there is less of, it's because of our Jewishness, if you will, that this natural law that allows us to do these things, because otherwise we wouldn't be a sovereign state, a Jewish state. We would be overrun. And so it used to be called the problem of 2020, but now we're in 2020, but that's back in the 70s, the way they labeled it.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'll try and answer that. And I also want to make sure that I'm clear and to put this into context and perspective, that the Israeli settlement enterprise in the West Bank is not the core obstacle to peace between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and the Arabs. And we know that that is the case. It is an issue for sure. But when we look at history, there were 3 Arab-Israeli wars before there was a single Israeli-Jewish settlement in the West Bank. There was the 1948 war, there was the 1956 Suez campaign, and the 1967 war. So I just want to make sure that I put that in that perspective, in that context, that while settlements are certainly an issue, and it's a hot issue, it is not the issue, and it has never been the issue, because there were, before 1967, there were 3 Arab-Israeli wars against Israel, where it wasn't about settlements. There were no Jews living in the West Bank. Remember, that was under Jordanian control. At that time, those conflicts and wars were really about Israel's very existence, and that there was no recognition of Israel to exist in any borders as a sovereign state. But today, there has been progress, and now many Arab states, not just Egypt and Jordan, but others, have come to the conclusion that Israel is not only a reality and it's not going away, but we want to work with it. We want to be welcoming to it in a certain capacity and with certain limitations, but certainly we're not seeking its destruction. So that's important to specify. But again, I think this whole issue with legitimacy internationally and Israel's democracy and Israel's majority is, I think this goes back to the founding fathers of the Zionist movement and the founding fathers of Israel in the very beginning of the Israeli state. And as I understand it, Israel's very raison d'etre from the beginning, its reason for existence, was to be a majority Jewish country that's democratic and that does not rule over indefinitely another people. I don't personally believe that if that were really true or the case, I don't think that would have convinced millions of international Jews from Morocco to Poland to Russia to Iraq to Libya to England to America to get up from their homes, leave the comfort of their homes and move to Israel. If they knew that that's what Zionism and what Israel was all about, to be in constant conflict with the Arabs. I think the crux of Israel's raison d'etre and its essence of what it was meant to be, and I still think many people still think that this is what it should be, is for the Jews of Israel to be the masters of their own destiny, never to be victims again, but to be the masters of their own destiny in their ancestral homeland, to be the majority, and to have a democratic system with an Arab minority that is respected, evident by the fact that Arabic is also an official language, and that the Arabs of Israel, that are 20% of the population, enjoy citizenship, the right to vote. They're part of the government. They're part of the Knesset. That's how I see it. And I think what happened was there has been a movement after 1967 where some Israelis in power came to the conclusion or the assumption that if the Arabs, or if the Palestinians more specifically, are not willing to negotiate, recognize, come to terms with us for being here and being our neighbors, then we're gonna settle in parts of Judea and Samaria, our ancestral biblical homeland. We're gonna spread throughout what is greater Israel, which is different from Medinat Yisrael, which is the state of Israel, but we're gonna spread throughout greater Israel, and we're gonna sit here and we're gonna expand, if and when or until there is a real interlocutor on the Palestinian side. And I think over time, after 1967, the Israeli settlements, they didn't happen right away. It was a gradual process. And over time, it grew and it grew and it grew. And now we have a situation where you have almost the same number. It's like a reciprocal where there's, 1/5 of the population of Israel is Arab. In the West Bank, it's almost 20% now Israeli settler. Because that this situation has gone on for 53 years. So I think the Netanyahu administration, they have made it clear that they're not really interested at this stage in creating a Palestinian state. Previous Israeli administrations have expressed and acted on a willingness to negotiate. But once again, I think that's how we see this shift. I think so many people became disillusioned about a two-state settlement and negotiation with the Palestinians, and that's why we have the current situation with Netanyahu and his desire to annex.
So there are a number of questions, one of which is that with an impending November election, and if there is a change of power in the United States and Biden becomes the leader in the White House, what effect will that have, do you think, on Netanyahu? And then in addition, there was another question, which is a good question. How have the conflicts in Syria and Yemen deflected the UAE and Saudi Arabia from focusing on the Palestinian issue?
Okay, great questions. Thank you very much. If Joe Biden becomes president, I think the Israelis will be, who, by the way, is a friend, and he has a long track record in with his voting record of supporting Israel. But I think that the Netanyahu government would be much more reluctant to pursue any type of unilateral policies in the West Bank out of fear of harming or jeopardizing a relationship with the United States. So I definitely think that would temper Israeli actions. And with the other question, how has, I'm sorry, could you repeat the other question?
The other question was, how has the conflicts in Syria and Yemen deflected the UAE and Saudi Arabia from focusing on the Palestinian issues?
I think not just with that, but if we look at the map of North Africa and the Middle East, I mean, most of the Arab countries are totally preoccupied with their own internal affairs, and they're really not preoccupied that much at all, other than paying lip service to the Palestinians. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Libya since the departure of Gaddafi, there are two rival governments in Libya right now that are vying for influence, and there's a proxy war going on there. There's pockets of terrorism in Libya. There's reports of modern day slavery in Libya. Egypt, is a shell of its former self when it was at its height of influence and prestige in the 1950s and 60s under Gamal Abdel Nasser. Egypt today does not project the same type of power and influence that it once had. Syria, as we all know, has been engulfed in civil war for 9 years. 500,000 displaced, 10 million killed. It's a very tragic humanitarian situation. Yemen is also another major humanitarian catastrophe, and there's a proxy war going on there. I mean, look at what's going on in Iraq. Lebanon is very unstable. So when you look at the wider Middle East, most of these countries are really looking to survive and to focus on their own domestic issues. They're really not terribly focused on the Palestinian issue.
there are a number of questions on timing, and given the election, given the opportunity of election, given what's going on now, the question is, do you think that Netanyahu will try to move this along as quick as possible now?
Possibly, if he perceives that there is a rare window of opportunity to do this with tacit encouragement from the United States, he may do so. However, you know, I still give some pause into wondering, you know, will he actually go through with this? Talking about this is one thing, but doing it is entirely different. He has made in the past previous assertions or claims to do other things, such as to strike Iran. We will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. There are things that he said in the past, but he has not lived through or fulfilled. So it's still not entirely clear that he will actually go through this. However, like I said, if he were to do this, I would imagine that he would try and do it very soon, while the world is distracted and while he believes that he has an ally in the White House.
Do you believe that at this particular time that the internal politics that are going on in Israel in regard to the virus and other things, and the existing tensions between Netanyahu and Gantz are being affected by this annexation fixation by Netanyahu?
I think that should be the priority, is the safety and welfare of the people, of any people when there's a pandemic and a major health crisis. But, you know, just looking at the news, my hunch is that it hasn't dampened or tempered discussion about annexation. I think that's still very much in the forefront, despite COVID, despite the risks and the security concerns and the health concerns, which is really interesting, because for those who might not know, that when this first appeared on the scene in a meaningful way, when everyone became aware of it in March of this year, there was actually a lot of good reporting of close cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. You know, there was a mutual interest in cooperating with each other to protect each other from the spread and proliferation of this virus. And there was a lot of technology expertise and training and healthcare that was being distributed to the Palestinians, because there was a mutual interest that what happens in the West Bank and Gaza, but specifically the West Bank, but what happens there does not spill over into Israel or to Jordan, for that matter, and vice versa. So there had been, and there still is, cooperation over COVID, and I think that that's a good thing, and I think that should remain. But you know, I think politicians will always be politicians wherever they are, and I'm not sure that the pandemic will totally temper people's fixation on this conversation.
So there's a lot of speculation that Netanyahu is already lured two people from the Gantz parties in order to fortify and make it to secure his leadership. And I don't know whether he'd call for new elections or whatever, or just leverage the power. Second of all, the Minister of Health, if I am correct, the number has remained very small of the number of virus cases and deaths in the West Bank itself. That is not true now, however, of Israel itself. Israel has had an explosion since the reopening, so much so that the head of the person from the Weizmann Institute, who had been head of the medical COVID committee, has written a letter to the Knesset and to the Prime Minister saying that the responsibility should be taken out of the hands of both the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Health and placed in the Army's hands, so that it can be, in his clear words, an objective filling of the policies. So how is this, do you think, affecting? And there's also speculation that the use of Netanyahu for pulling out, I think, is it called the mandate, the mandate policy, in which he's taken emergency control and stopped trials and stopped everything.
Certainly, I'll try and answer that question the best I can. I think I would just kind of, reiterate what I said, is that the cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is mutually beneficial, and I think that it should continue. There is a strategic interest for both sides to cooperate against this virus, because we all know that this virus, this COVID-19, it does not discriminate against Muslim, Christian, or Jew, or Israeli, or Palestinian. Everyone has been affected. I hope that cooperation continues, because it is absolutely needed when you look at how small the territory that we're talking about is and how easily it can spread. I do know, as you, I think, mentioned, that Israel is one of the first countries to really do a lockdown and to try to get a hold of this, to contain it. And then they started to loosen things up and go back to school and go back to the beaches. And as we've all seen, I think the numbers now are going back up. For new cases, the numbers are going back really high, which is concerning. In the West Bank, like in other parts of the Arab world, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I think we have to be cautious about what numbers we're looking at and where we're getting the sources, because I can tell you that particularly in places like in the Gulf, whatever numbers that we're hearing from the officials or the leaders are not the accurate numbers. They're much higher. And so for political reasons, some leaders in certain countries want to appear strong and stable and that they're in control, that they're conflating the numbers, and they're minimizing the numbers to make it look like it's much less than it actually is. But I think the numbers are actually quite higher in some of these countries. So there's always that piece too. And I'll just leave it with that, and happy to take
Michael,
the next
one last question, or two parts. One is and we know that you can't for sure this, but it says is Israel responsible for the recent sabotage on the Iran nuclear facility? I would add to a question which you might be able to answer more definitively, which is what type of effect will that have on the region, such a sabotage, and is it a positive effect?
Sure. Look, I read the newspapers like everyone else here, and my guess is one can only draw certain conclusions of who could be responsible for such an attack. There's probably two countries that come to mind, and I'll leave that to your imagination of who could pull off something like that. I suspect that Israel's efforts to roll back or to thwart the possibility of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, will be done similar to how we've seen it over the past decade. Cyber attacks, sabotage, doing things, not with kinetic, direct military strikes in some kind of conventional way, but doing things using much more like with technology, with computers, with cyber, any way where they can try and slow down the possibility. My general sense is that's what we have seen, and that's what we will likely see. We probably won't see a conventional, traditional military attack like, when you think about in much of the 20th century. I think the new battlefield for a lot of the Middle East will be fought over digitally. It'll be fought over with artificial intelligence, with cyber attacks, things like that. And again, having said that, there's only a handful, very few, maybe on one hand, of countries that could effectively execute such an operation. So I would, leave that all to your imagination.
So Michael, I want to thank you so much. This has been an incredible opportunity, and very impressive that at one point we had well over 100 people, 100 devices on, and I think that's to the credit of your reputation as a teacher for us and what's going on. I hope we can entice you to do some more for us over the summer. I'm going to leave with, let you have some closing remarks. But the last thing that I would just want to ask you about is that your thoughts of the effect of the pre and post Middle East based on the pandemic, because I do know that it has been there have been very interesting things that have happened. Some of the top Muslim leaders have agreed to make statements about the value of science, which is really unprecedented for some of these imams and some of these muftis to do. In addition, we have to remember that the word Islam actually means submission. And I think that the pandemic has reinstituted, if you will, a style or a group of society, making them understand how incredibly dependent their lives are upon government, and especially in the time of the pandemic. And I know that in Iran and Saudi Arabia, there's been massive effect on the societies on the pandemic, and there's great fear in the UAE to keep those borders from being porous. So just your last thoughts on the effect of the pandemics and what will be the Middle East might look like post-pandemic, or what effects you might think that this would have on future.
It's a great question. And again, I want to thank everyone for their excellent questions. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. Look, I think with this COVID-19, I think this is still very preliminary. We're like in chapter 1 of a very difficult and uncertain time. No one really knows how this is all going to play out and what it's going to look like. But my general reading, when I look at the greater Middle East region and the millions of people, just like the people in this country that have been affected by the pandemic, and when you factor in that you have millions of people, particularly young men, that have lost their jobs, that are living at home, they're frustrated, they're scared, they're angry. My sense is that while things might be relatively calm or quiet, because people might be afraid to pour into the streets today, perhaps to protest for greater economic rights and liberties, etc. My sense is that there's a lot of bottled up frustration, and in a certain time in the near future, just like we saw 9 years ago, 9 years ago in Tunisia, start with Tunisia and then spread across the Middle East. I think we might see, unfortunately, another wave of Arab Spring style protests, where people are going to be insisting, they're going to be asking, they are asking questions, but I think that you will see them when conditions might be a little safer, going back into the streets, and they're going to be, insisting on jobs. And this whole issue, forget about terrorism and violence and extremism for a moment, but this whole issue of sustainability in the North Africa, Middle East region is a long-term issue. It has been written about for 20 years now by Arab intellectuals. This was codified in the Arab Human Development Report back in 2000. And they were really warning, these Arab intellectuals, years ago, that the Arab world is struggling to sustain its population, to provide good jobs for the 21st century, to educate their women and bring them into the 21st century workforce, to have open and free societies and media and freedom of expression and things like this. We saw this happen in 2011, and we saw it depose longstanding leaders like Gaddafi, like Mubarak. So my sense is that this is far from over, and you will see people, when it's safe, my guess, return into the streets, and they're going to be asking a lot of questions to their government. about how they can improve their lives and how they can have jobs and you know, how can they provide for their family and how can they support themselves? How are these the real challenges? How are these Arab leaders and these Arab societies, how will they be able to sustain their populations? And if they can't, where are these millions of educated Arabs, men and women, where are they going to go if they can't find work in their home countries? This is a long-term security challenge and concern, not just for the region. This is for Europe. Europe is thinking about this, and so should the United States.
We thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. I do hope that you'll come back and join us again. I think we can, I'm going to unmute everybody so people can simply just applaud. It was outstanding as always. Thank you so much.
Michael.
Thank you.
We would love to have you back again on any subject you would like. You're a phenomenal pedagogue. You're a great teacher, and we really appreciate the opportunity. I want to remind people again that we have a great program coming up with Jack, with Ludwig, Ken Ludwig, and keep abreast. And Walking in Hebrew wishes you well, and we hope that everybody is safe out there. Everybody, good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.